Welcome back. In the last video, we made a custom visualization that got published as a Domo app that lets us view data in a different way than we normally would on Domo. This time we'll do something a little bit more involved in some ways, but less involved in other ways. It'll be a simpler visualization, so it'll be just a table. But this time, instead of just displaying data that's already existing in Domo, we're actually going to interact with that data in a bidirectional sense. In other words, we are going to annotate that data based on some predefined interactions that we've set in this app that we'll be making together. That data will then get written back to Domo and made available as a second data set for you to transform or use in other data flows later down the line. In this example, we're going to be using React, which is a UI framework that's really popular, and Create React App, which is a tool that lets you create applications in the React framework very easily. Domo has support for Create React App, so we'll actually be able to use all the developer tooling we normally get out of Create React App, like hot reloading and local development, for free with Domo's Proxy that they've added into a Create React App template. So this is probably my favorite example out of all of them because I think this is the one with the most real-world applications that really gets me excited about workflows and getting automating workflows and decisions through Domo. Here's the app. I don't really have a name for it. I called it React Test, but maybe leads management would probably be a good name for it. So as you can see, we queried Domo. I'll refresh for you so you can see that query process. We've got a skeleton that shows up, a little hello at the bottom for my testing. I got to remove that. We've got a table that shows up with UI that looks fairly similar to what Domo has. ID, names, titles, company name, city, state, interested. So this is very similar to the Sugar4 sample data that shows up in the table, along with an interaction here, interested, and either data that shows up here, yes, no, or an actual way for me to interact with these buttons. So if I contacted Justina McShane and she was not interested, I could hit X and it would write no. Where this gets really interesting is I can actually refresh the page and that will persist across page refreshes and actually across browsers. So if someone else were to load the app, they would see this data persisting. In addition to that, on a periodic basis between 5 and 15 minutes each time, this data does get written to a data set within Domo. So this is what that data set looks like. The name is auto-generated, but you'll see here that ID2 has said yes. ID2 is interested is true. ID6 is interested is false. So right there, you can see we have our data. And of course, the one that I've just interacted with will show up in about 5 or 15 minutes. These other columns prefixed with double underscores are internal to Domo's AppDB. However, some of them are useful, like for instance, the user ID of whoever created the specific record, when it was created, who's modified it, and when it was modified. Those could be useful down the line. We won't be using them for now. And just an aside on how these app collections sync with Domo. It does happen. It does take a little while for that data to make it into Domo, but that data is immediately available from within your app. So there's no concerns about losing consistency from within an app itself. The output data set is a reflection of what is in the Domo app, and that's what takes a little bit longer and can become stale for just a few minutes while we wait for a sync. So there is a repo as well with this data in it, or with the code, called a Leads Manager Domo app. Similar to the custom visualization one, it's under my name, Jay Pumford, Leads Manager Domo app on github.com. And this README is the default that comes with Create React App. So let's build this together. We'll start by setting up Create React App to work with Domo. You can also do this with TypeScript. It'll take a little bit more work. Just as an aside, if you like TypeScript, that's totally possible to do. For now, we'll just focus on how you do that with JavaScript. So we're going to use npx, which is a tool that comes with npm. Create React App. We can call it whatever we want. So in this case, I'll call it Leads Manager. And then we're going to add this extra flag called template at Domo Inc. So this will instruct Create React App to use a slightly different template for creating the React application. And that's one that's been curated by the team at Domo as one that will work well with Domo and allow you to develop locally while proxying your requests to Domo, which is really, really nice to have. So that'll take a second, probably about, depending on the speed of your computer, here it might take about 30 seconds. Just like those chefs on TV, I've paused and let things bake, and now Create React App is done setting up its magic. Here's the project it's set up for me. There's a few important parts of it. These will probably look familiar to you if you're familiar with front-end development, but all the code is going to be in the source directory. Setup proxy is something that Domo's created for us that allows us to proxy our requests off to Domo and let us run the apps locally. So let's start this app locally. Easiest way to do that, new terminal here. We're in the directory. To look at the README, which lets us know to run yarn start to start the application. We'll run yarn start. And we'll give it a second, and it will start the development server. You could expect your browser to open in another window, and you will see something along the lines of this. Edit source /app.js and save to reload, which is exactly what we can do. And that's actually really nice to have. If we go into app.js and we edit it by saying hello world, suppose, save it, wait a second, and go back, and there's our hello world. So this really speeds up app development. I can't even overstate how crucial having hot reloading is to developing apps in a timely fashion. And that's what makes using Create React App my favorite way to develop Domo apps. There's a few other things. We need to get an app ID. In order to get that, we need to publish the app. We have a command called yarn upload, which, if we've logged in already through the Domo CLI, through Domo login, will actually build and then upload our app to the Domo instance for us directly. Let's run yarn upload. It'll run a production build. Those usually take anywhere from 20 to 20 seconds to a minute, depending on how big the app is. The app's fairly small, so that was very quick. We can now go to our instance, go to our asset library, and see this new design that we've just updated. From here, we can go back to our code. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. Follow close. We'll go into the build directory. We'll then go to manifest.json here, and we will see this ID field. This is really important. We're going to want to copy this ID after our first upload, and then go into the public directory, go into manifest.json here, and add that into manifest.json with the ID key. This lets Create React App know where it should be publishing things. Now there's a few other things that we're going to need to put into manifest.json in order to allow us to, number one, query data from Domo through the mapping, and then number two, also store data within a technology called AppDB, which is Domo App's persistent storage through a key called collections. Those are the two very important things that we'll need to be doing to, number one, query data from Domo, and then store data in Domo. Now, to be able to query data in Domo, we need to add a field into mapping. We'll start by giving it a dataset ID, which I already have for my Sugarforce sample data. So that's the dataset you'll want to be using. Here's the ID that I have for that. We're going to give it an alias. In this case, I'll call it leads. And then we need to give it some fields. For right now, just an empty array, and that's sufficient. I'll just select everything based on the column name. So that handles our querying from Domo. Actually writing data to Domo, we'll need to add in a collections key, which is an array of objects. One of these objects is a key name. We'll call it lead results. That's the name of the collection. And since we're going to be syncing things back to Domo, we actually have to add a schema. Give it columns, which is also an array of objects. The first column is ID, and its type is long, which stands for long integer. So just an integer. The next one is interested. Now this one will be a Boolean type, but Booleans aren't a proper type in AppDB. So we'll just do strings, and we'll just have a string true, string false. And that'll work just fine. Now it's important to note that you don't actually need to put in a schema for AppDB. AppDB is actually based off of a schema-less database, and it doesn't really care if you have a schema. However, data sets within Domo have schemas. So if you do want to sync this collection back to Domo in the form of a data set, as I demonstrated earlier in the video, then you will actually need to provide a schema. And then you will provide this key sync enabled true. And that's all you have to do. So we're going to run yarn upload again just to publish this changed manifest. That'll rebuild the application. This will allow us to instantiate an app and have a collection created as part of that creation of the app itself. Once we do that, we're going to grab something called the Proxy ID from an instance of the app and add it into manifest.json. And then we will be done with manifest.json. So let me refresh this just to make sure that it published correctly. Updated a few seconds ago, and that's what we expect. So we're going to say new app, React App 2, wire it up with data. Mine wires up automatically because I've specified the dataset ID. And then we hit save and finish. From here, it will show up on our overview. Then right click it. We can do inspect element here. And we're going to look for an iframe. You should have your inspector show up no matter which browser you're using, Chrome, Safari, whatever it might be. We're going to look for an iframe here. And what we want out of this iframe is a URL. Right click that, open it in a new tab. We can actually open this app as a standalone. And then we're going to go into the URL and look for a hash, this identifier that shows up at the very beginning of the URL, much like a data set, where it would show up actually near the end of the URL. That hash is important. That's actually our proxy ID. To add in the proxy ID, we go back into manifest.json, we type in proxy ID, and then we paste that ID in and save. Next, we need to add a few dependencies that we're going to use. I like Ant Design. Ant Design is a component library that is just a collection of React components that you can import into your project that let you style things very easily. I find that Ant Design is probably one of the easiest libraries that looks similar to Domo and has quite a few options as far as components, and they all are high quality and work really well within Domo. So in order to add ant design, we're going to say yarn add ant d, which stands for ant design. And then we're going to add at ant design / icons because we were using a few icons. We'll wait for that to run. Perfect. Now that that's added our dependencies, we can copy over some code. So we're going to go back to GitHub, to the Leads Manager Domo app. Going to go into source and then into app.js. We're going to click raw, copy all of this, and then put that into app.js right here. From here, we're going to run yarn start. We'll wait a second for it to start up. Then from here, we'll be able to go back to our React app, refresh. And once it's done building the application, we should see our app running correctly. And here's an example of an error. We haven't added Ryu.js. In order to do that, we'll run Control-C and run yarn add Ryu.js. My mistake. Ryu.js is really actually just an alias for Domo.js, that file that we saw plenty of times in the past that allows us to interact with Domo. We're going to be using it again here. So we'll start the development server again, go back, hit refresh, and here it is. It looks a little bit different, and the reason for that is because we haven't imported ant design styles yet. But we are loading data from Domo, and we are actually able to interact with it very easily and write to appdb by hitting, for instance, check for yes. We wait a second, and if we refresh, it should persist that information as it has in appdb. This shows us that we are actually locally proxying to Domo servers and allowed to read and write data to Domo from our local development server. So to add the CSS, we are going to go into index.css here. And we're going to add a new line where we import it in at import tilde antd /dist /antd.css with a semicolon at the end because we write good CSS. From this, we should be able to refresh, and there's our app in all its glory. We can filter as well based on state. Right now, I just added Texas because Texans are proud, and I figured if there's one state to add, why not add Texas? So let's go through how the code works. All of the code that we care about is in app.js. It's really quite simple, and it's kind of shocking what you can get done in such few lines when you're using React. As you can see, it's about 130 lines, whereas our custom visualization with D3 was about 250. Granted, this is only showing a table, but it is an interactive table that writes and reads to Domo. If you're familiar with React, you'll know that everything is a function, and now it is anyway, and the functions themselves are named the name of your component. So here we are exporting a component named app right down here, and that component has two effects that run at startup. The first effect empties the table data. It checks what filter we're using, as you remember that filter that allows us to choose which state we're doing. If we're not filtering at all, in other words, we want to show everything, we are running a data query, data/v1/leads. We're getting the ID, name, title, company name, city, and state fields. And we're limiting to 100 just to not overdo things if our computer is running a little bit slower. If we are filtering by state, we actually add this filter option here. And so this is something new that we haven't seen yet before. We say state contains, and then we take the filter and convert it to uppercase. We then run domo.get, and then with the resultant data, we set state to, we set the table data in our useState query here, our useState hook, to be equal to the data that we got back from Domo. We run this effect anytime that the filter has changed, also on mount. This effect gets the annotation data. The annotation data does not change when the filter has been changed. So we don't have any dependencies in the dependency array for this hook. It just loads when we've loaded the app. So on each refresh. This is a little bit different. Like Sugarforce, it is also querying appdb as opposed to just a data set. So you'll see a URL very similar to that used in Sugarforce. Domo/datastores/v1/collections, and then a collection name, lead results, and we're getting all the documents from that. From there, we are basically changing the way the data is shaped. We, rather than an array, we actually are making a map of IDs to whether or not that certain ID is interested. That'll be useful later in the app because it will be much easier to read that data than having to search an array for every single record. I'll go over this a little bit later. We configure our columns in a fashion ant-design understands. You can learn more about how this works by reading the ant-design documentation for table. Title, ID, so we've got name, company name, city, state, and then another field called interested. This has a custom renderer, which can also be read about on ant-design's documentation, that renders either a button if they're interested, or if they haven't responded whether or not they're interested, as detailed over here, or whether or not they're interested if they've specified whether or not they're interested. Then later, we join those two data sets together. In other words, the data set we got back from Domo's data API, from that data set of leads, and then also the data we got back from appdb on responding whether or not people are interested. Once we've joined that, we put it into the table. If that joined table data is undefined, we can assume we're in the middle of loading, and so we drop a skeleton in its place. Then the actual component itself is pretty small. At this point, we have a form with our select and then the table, and that's it. So there are two really important kind of callback functions that we run whenever something is interacted with. Set filter, whenever that state filter has been changed, and then also one that runs whenever these buttons are clicked. Now the set filter change handler is really just coming from useState. So this is a pretty simple React callback. We see this quite often. The more interesting one is setting is interested. So when a button is clicked, if they're interested, we set is interested. We send it the ID of the person who's interested and a Boolean true if they are interested. Otherwise, we still send the ID, but also Boolean value of false. Set is interested will update local state. That way stuff stays in sync between what we have running locally and what we have on the server, but then also updates the server through a domo.post. So this is adding a new record onto Domo's appdb. And this is exactly the same as it's done in Sugarforce. /domo/datastores v1 collections lead results documents. We're posting to that and we're giving it some content to to store in AppDB. So that's all there really is to this app. I think by now, if we're lucky and we go into our data, the output data set of AppDB, we should be able to refresh it and see that extra record we added earlier today. And there it is. It's been added in. So there's a little bit of latency before the data actually updates in Domo, but there is no latency with respect to the app. So the app itself that is using AppDB will update immediately and provide a really great user experience, in my opinion. So be able to click on this, record 4 with ID number 4 will update, and that will persist to Domo, as you can see here. That's all there is to it. The code is really not terribly complicated, and it's much easier doing it in React as well, as opposed to having to write all that display logic ourselves. So there you have it. Again, we can filter by state, we can unfilter, we can mark things, they can persist, and those will be written back to a Domo data source within about 5 minutes, where you can consume them in a data flow or however else you'd like to. Thanks for joining, and we'll hopefully see you sometime soon.